Hello, welcome to week 3 of Humanities 2. So this is our pre-reading lecture for our article by Emily Riskin called The Defecating Duck, and we'll be talking about the mind, the body, and eventually the duck that Riskin refers to in her title. Okay, so I wanted to give everyone some background about this era that we're looking at, the era of Enlightenment as it's often referred to. Which is both a political and philosophical revolution that sort of sees its roots in the 17th and 18th century. So some of the people that we're going to talk about in order to get our bearings for Riskin's article include René Descartes and his idea of the mind-body dualism, and then we'll talk about Thomas Hobbes and how he defined human life and this idea of materialism, which we'll talk about in the philosophical sense. Then I'll offer some ideas and questions to keep in mind while you are doing our reading for this week by Emily Riskin. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is, as I mentioned, an intellectual and political movement, and what is at the center of this belief system is the idea that man, right, not God, but shapes his own future. So there is this centrality of this belief in the power of man to kind of make his own world, and in particular the tools that man has to make his own world and to move society towards a more just future are these ideas of rationality and reason. These become central to the way that intellectuals and political activists associated with the Enlightenment begin to understand themselves. So what we are seeing here is the development of this concept and ideal of the free individual. So instead of an individual being bound by their fate or bound by what God might have to say about one's value, this is a secular worldview that believes in the centrality of man to shape his world. And in that way, the free individual becomes this call for greater liberty and greater equality as well. So these ideas of progress towards a more just society in the sense of the free individual are kind of responding to the political systems in Western Europe that we'll talk about in a moment. So the roots of the Enlightenment movement are in the work of a series of scientists and thinkers, including Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and René Descartes, and we'll talk about Hobbes and Descartes a little bit more today. Okay, so the Enlightenment is also marked by this emphasis on categorization, so putting everything into a category and trying to define everything we know. So we're probably familiar with the concept of the encyclopedia. That is a idea that very much is born out of this Enlightenment sensibility, that we could in fact categorize and put all human knowledge into a book, is very reflective of this Enlightenment sensibility of organizing human knowledge and putting all things into definable categories. So in addition to seeking to organize human knowledge and the pursuit and research towards the creation of knowledge, we also see the way that Enlightenment thought is interested in social organization as well. So this concept of the citizen that we are familiar with, because it has a lot to do with how we frame our access to rights here in the United States, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we move forward in the semester. What we begin to see here with this interest in kind of carving out and categorizing everything is like, so what is it exactly to be human? So that kind of question of the essence of humanness. What is it? What's on the list, right? How do we declare ourselves to be human? Now that we are declaring that to be human is to have a set of rights and a set of freedoms as well. So it becomes important to define what it means to be human, because these Enlightenment thinkers are suggesting that simply by being human, you are entitled to a set of rights and privileges. And we'll talk about the limits to the school of thought as we move forward. So when we're thinking about Enlightenment thinkers, as I mentioned, many of these thinkers are working in France and England, in Western Europe, and they are living in a world of monarchs, kings and queens, lords and ladies. The aristocracy as they are called. So the spirit of the Enlightenment is anti-aristocratic. And so what we see here is the sense that the category of citizen is declaring access to a set of natural rights. And it's developing this in response to the kind of political hierarchy of an aristocracy, where lords and ladies are simply sort of born with power. And if you weren't born a lord or a lady or a king or a queen, you don't really have access to power. So the thinkers that are pushing this Enlightenment school of thought would like to see themselves as people who have access to power. So at the same time that Enlightenment thinkers are declaring their own value and developing the sense of the citizen as this category through which you access rights and privileges, what also happens is that you are deciding who does not fall under the category of citizen. So categorization has the impact of creating, right, this kind of binary or this set of citizen versus non-citizen. This is something we'll explore further during week 4. Okay, so what we begin to see here is that Enlightenment thinkers are not just categorizing knowledge without judgment. They are developing a set of hierarchies and a set of value judgments that create a sense of not just social organization, but social hierarchy. So while they're pushing against this kind of idea of hereditary power, that lords and ladies inherit their power, they are still developing a set of hierarchies, a ranking, as it were, and the way that they are reorganizing and understanding how a social system will work. Okay, so let's talk about Descartes. So René Descartes is French. That's why there's all those letters we don't pronounce in his name. So when we are talking about Descartes, one of the ways that we want to use his theories is by taking a look at the mind-body dualism. So he's one of these thinkers who's trying to define humanness. He's like, well, we got to break it down, right? What does it mean to be human? How do we begin to study humanness? What do we do? So for Descartes to begin to make sense of humanity from this Enlightenment standpoint, he's like, let me make 2 categories. We got the mind and we got the body. Okay, so when he's working on his definition of humanness, he has this split, these 2 categories, the mind and the body. So he says the mind is a thing that thinks. And if we recall what we mentioned a moment ago, rationality, reason, and rational thought are central to the perspective of Enlightenment thinkers. So we want to sort of keep that in the back of our mind. So then he suggests that the body is an extended thing, right? So it's a thing. And so what we are seeing here is that Descartes is like, okay, we can study the body. This is where we get the rise of physiology and things of that nature. We can understand the things that the body does. But on the other hand, he suggests that the mind can't be interpreted or understood because it is too complex. So there's this celebration of the act of thinking, right? These ideas of rationality and reason as really complex and hard to interpret and understand. Okay, and so this is a quote from Descartes that gives us a sense of what I'm getting at here. So he says, I'm present to my body not merely the way a seaman is present to his ship, but I'm tightly joined to it, mingled together with it, so much so that I am a single thing with it. So the thing we want to note here is that he is identifying himself with the mind, right? So when we say I am, we are sort of attaching ourself to something. So he's saying, I am present to my body. And he's suggesting that the I in that statement is the mind. And so he's creating a kind of ranking that sees the mind as more important, more complex, and superior to the body. So keep that idea in mind, that kind of ranking that we're talking about here. Okay, so Descartes then goes on to suggest that based on this kind of dualism that he concludes that reason is central to the definition of humanness. So that becomes kind of the core of what it means to be human. So Descartes suggested that we could understand the material world, right? The kind of workings of our body and the workings of nature could be understood through empirical research. And so when we say empirical research, that means firsthand study, right? It's the kind of show me perspective. I need to see it to believe it. So we see this again giving rise to the field of physiology that studies the behavior of the mechanisms and observable aspects of what the body does. And this kind of idea that you can understand the nature of something through studying the mechanisms, the observable behaviors, is referred to as materialism. And we can think about that as like, if I'm looking at it and watching it work, I'm seeing what I need to know. That materialism is interested in that kind of observation of behaviors and mechanisms. On the other hand, he's kind of like, I don't think that physiologists can really understand the mind. So he suggests that it is philosophers that should study the human mind and study rationality and reason, that in fact it's better left to the more abstract thinkers, the philosophers of the world, to explain what the mind is up to and what is happening with the mind as well. So what we're kind of seeing here is that the mechanisms and the consciousness of humanness are being separated into this mind-body dualism that we are looking at here. Okay, so what we're seeing is that the kind of limit conditions of humanity are what Descartes is after. He's trying to define what it means to be human. So it's like, well, what are the edges of humanity? So keep that in mind, right? This kind of project of Enlightenment thought is to kind of define essences to their edges and to their limits. Okay, so Hobbes, on the other hand, is kind of like, sorry Descartes, but I think that humans are essentially entirely material. Everything can be explained by the observation of mechanisms, that we are essentially all body, no mind. So he says, life is but a motion of limbs, for what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body. So Hobbes is essentially saying we're no different than any other living thing on earth. And that is significant, right? If there's one thing that the Enlightenment thinkers want to do is to define how special humans are, that they are unique in their possession of reason and rationality. And Hobbes is like, I don't think so. We're not that special. Okay. So because we're not that special, Hobbes kind of comes to a pretty dim conclusion about political systems. He's kind of like, well, because we're just a bunch of irrational kind of mechanical things rolling around the world, you need strong state control in order to regulate this kind of mass of unruly, non-rational bodies, which is how he sees humanity. So pretty dim view. And he's an interesting guy. If you're interested in reading more of his ideas, you can kind of get a sense of how it relates to his ideas about political systems as well. Okay, so there's a couple of words I wanted to just touch on so you have them in your back pocket as you jump in to read our article by Riskin. So one of the words is epistemology. And so this is essentially the study of, or the theory of, knowledge. And what this means is, for our purposes in our class, we're thinking about how what counts as a belief and what counts as an opinion and how that changes over time. So at a certain point, it was completely true, right, for the historical moment to say that the world is flat. Then, as we sort of see the kind of growth of a scientific revolution, that no longer becomes acceptable. And that's the reflection of a shift in epistemology, a shift in what we take to be true. Okay. Ontology, on the other hand, is this definition of essences. So again, that kind of pursuit of like, how do we define humanness? What makes it special is an ontological pursuit. If I wanted to think about the essence of what it means to be a chair, is that there must be somewhere for me to sit down, that there must be legs and there must be a back, right? This kind of, what are the limit conditions of being and the limit conditions of existence about a particular thing. And then verisimilitude is going to be important because this is sort of getting us into this discussion about the kind of truthfulness of these pieces of artificial intelligence that Riskin is writing about. So verisimilitude refers to this kind of appearance of being true or real. Okay.